Ethan had always admired Lena's passion for astronomy. It was one of the things he loved about her. The way her eyes lit up when she spoke about the universe, how she could talk for hours about constellations, black holes, and the possibility of life beyond Earth. When she started spending more and more nights at the observatory, he didn't question it. At first, it had been endearing. She'd return home late, slipping into bed beside him, her skin still cool from the night air. She'd whisper about the stars she'd seen, the discoveries she had read about. Ethan would listen, half asleep but comforted by the sound of her voice. But then something changed. The stories became vague. She stopped sharing details, no more talk of meteor showers or distant galaxies. When Ethan asked how her night had gone, she'd shrug and say something non-committal. It was fine, she'd murmur before turning away. Ethan noticed other things too. She was distracted during the day, checking her phone more often than usual, smiling at messages she never shared with him. Her perfume lingered longer than it used to, the scent stronger when she came home late. She'd started dressing differently for her nights at the observatory, swapping her usual cozy sweaters for fitted tops and delicate jewelry. At first, he told himself he was imagining things. He trusted Lena. They had been together for over a decade, built a life together. But trust, he realized, wasn't enough when the nagging doubts wouldn't go away. One evening, as she was getting ready, Ethan leaned against the bedroom doorway, watching her. "You never invite me to the observatory," he said, keeping his tone casual. Lena glanced at him in the mirror as she fastened an earring. "It's not that interesting," she replied. "You'd be bored." "I don't think I would," Ethan countered. "I'd love to see what fascinates you so much." She hesitated, just for a second, before forcing a smile. "Maybe another time," she said, brushing past him. The answer felt wrong. Forced. That night, as Lena left, Ethan sat alone in the quiet house, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over her location-sharing app. They had both agreed to keep it on years ago, not out of mistrust, but because it was practical. If either of them was running late or had car trouble, it was a way to stay connected. He tapped the screen. A map appeared, a small dot marking her location. But it wasn't at the observatory. His breath caught. She was somewhere else. Somewhere outside the city, a secluded overlook. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stared at the blinking dot. His mind raced with possibilities, but deep down, he already knew. Lena wasn't looking at the stars tonight. He was with someone else. And for the first time, Ethan understood that the universe she had been so captivated by had nothing to do with the night sky. It was something much closer to home, something she had tried to keep hidden in the darkness. But tonight he was going to bring it into the light. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he followed the narrow, winding road leading out of the city and into the quiet darkness of the countryside. The night was clear. The sky stretched wide above him, peppered with stars that gleamed cold and indifferent, their light spilling over the hills like silver dust. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears, louder than the hum of the engine, louder than the thoughts colliding in his mind, each one worse than the last. She wasn't at the observatory. She was here, and she wasn't alone. His stomach twisted at the thought, a slow and painful squeeze, but he forced himself to breathe, forced himself to keep his hands steady on the wheel. He told himself he wouldn't jump to conclusions, that there could be some reasonable explanation for why Lena's location showed her at a secluded overlook instead of where she said she would be. Maybe she had gotten lost. Maybe she had needed a break from the observatory. Maybe she had wanted to stargaze somewhere different, somewhere quieter. Maybe. But even as the excuses formed in his mind, he knew he didn't believe them. Ethan had never been to this overlook before, but he knew of it. It was a well-known secret among locals, a place where people went when they wanted to be alone, or when they didn't want to be seen. Lovers met here in hushed whispers. Parked cars lined the edges of the clearing late at night, windows fogged, doors locked, the world beyond forgotten. He clenched his jaw, his pulse a dull roar, and pressed the gas pedal just a little harder. The road climbed higher, winding through dense trees that swayed in the night breeze. He rolled down the window, let the cold air hit his face, hoping it would clear his head, but the suffocating weight in his chest didn't lift. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath until he saw it. Her car, Lena's car, parked off to the side of the overlook, tucked just far enough into the shadows that it wouldn't be immediately noticeable to passing vehicles. Ethan pulled over, killing the engine. His hands were still gripping the wheel, but now his fingers felt numb. He sat in the silence, staring at her car, at the way the moonlight glinted off the windshield, making it impossible to see inside. The air around him was still, thick with expectation, as if the night itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He didn't move right away. He needed a moment, needed to gather himself. He had imagined this scenario before, not in reality but in the stray paranoid thoughts that occasionally crossed his mind when Lena had first started spending more nights away, when she had come home smelling just a little different, when she had started hesitating before answering his questions. But now it wasn't paranoia, it was real, and he was here and she was right there, just beyond the trees, hidden beneath the stars she claimed to love so much. Ethan pushed the door open, stepping out onto the gravel, his boots crunching against the ground. The night air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling his lungs, but he barely noticed. His eyes locked onto the narrow footpath leading from the parking area to the clearing just beyond, the place where the view opened up to the vast stretch of sky. And then he heard it. Low voices, too distant to make out the words, but unmistakably intimate, soft and unguarded, carrying through the quiet like a melody meant for two. He moved carefully, each step deliberate and soundless. The path was uneven, the ground littered with fallen leaves and twigs, but he navigated it easily, his focus razor-sharp. He could see them now, just ahead, silhouetted against the night sky. Lena was leaning against him. Noah? Ethan recognized him immediately. He had met the man once, briefly, at a fundraiser Lena had insisted on attending. Noah had been charming, polite, articulate, the kind of man who made people feel special simply by listening. He wasn't overly handsome, but there was something about him, an ease, a quiet confidence, the kind of presence that could draw people in effortlessly. Ethan had thought nothing of him at the time, just another academic, another colleague, another face in the orbit of Lena's world. Now he saw him differently. Lena's body was angled toward him, her shoulder pressed against his, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something he was saying. Her arms weren't crossed, weren't held close to her body in the way she did when she was uncomfortable. They were relaxed, her fingers brushing lightly against her knee, her posture easy, natural, like she had done this 1,000 times before. And then Noah reached for her hand. Ethan watched, his breath locked in his throat, as Noah's fingers traced slow circles against her palm, as Lena let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head, but she didn't pull away. She didn't move an inch. The stars above them burned bright, but Ethan saw only darkness. His feet carried him forward before he even realized he was moving. The soft murmur of their conversation faded as his presence registered, as their bodies stiffened in unison, as Lena turned, her expression shifting in an instant. From laughter, to shock, to something else, something he couldn't quite place. Ethan. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Noah straightened, his hands slipping from Lena's, his eyes darting between them, calculating, assessing, searching for a way out of whatever this was about to become. Ethan held his ground, his pulse steady now, the storm inside him strangely quiet. He had expected rage, expected fury to claw its way up his throat and spill out in violent, unforgiving words. But instead, he just felt hollow. Lena opened her mouth, but whatever excuse she had been about to conjure died on her lips. She knew there was nothing she could say. Noah shifted slightly, like he was preparing to step back, to disappear into the night before he became collateral damage. But Ethan's voice stopped him cold. Don't. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was just a single word, firm and undeniable. Noah stilled. Ethan's gaze returned to Lena, taking in everything. The way her eyes darted to his, pleading and uncertain. The way her fingers twitched, searching for something to hold on to. The way her lips parted but no words came, and suddenly it all felt so small. The nights she had spent lying to him. The stolen glances, the whispered conversations, the secret moments carved out beneath the stars. It had felt enormous before, a weight crushing down on him, suffocating, but now, standing here, looking at them, at the two people who had turned him into a fool, All he felt was exhaustion. He took a step back, inhaling deeply, the cold air filling his lungs. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Behind him, Lena called his name, but he didn't look back. Ethan walked away, his steps steady but his thoughts chaotic, an internal battle raging between fury and devastation. He had imagined 100 different ways this moment could have played out, but not like this, not with the suffocating weight of exhaustion settling deep into his bones, not with the eerie quiet of the night amplifying the sound of his own breathing, not with Lena standing frozen behind him, the taste of his name still on her lip. He didn't need to turn around to know that she hadn't followed him, that she stood there in stunned silence, probably torn between chasing after him and staying with Noah, the man she had chosen when she thought no one was watching. The cold night air filled his lungs as he approached his car, his fingers trembling slightly as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket. His body was still reacting, still processing what his mind had already accepted. He had seen it with his own eyes. Lena nestled close to Noah, the touch of their hands, the laughter that had belonged to him once, the familiarity of it all. That was the part that made his chest ache the most. This wasn't a new, fleeting infatuation. This was something that had been growing in the shadows for a while, something nurtured, something deliberate. His fingers finally wrapped around the cold metal of the keys and he yanked them free, unlocking the car with a sharp beep that echoed into the night. He hesitated before getting in, leaning against the door, his eyes flicking back toward the clearing. He couldn't see them from here, but he knew they were still there, probably speaking in hushed voices, exchanging nervous glances, trying to piece together what would happen next. Maybe Noah was urging Lena to go after him. Maybe she was shaking her head, whispering that she needed a moment to think. Maybe she was crying. He forced himself into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. His breathing was uneven, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he had to get out of here. He had to put distance between himself and the betrayal that had unfolded beneath the stars. The engine roared to life, and as the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path back to the city, movement caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A figure, a familiar one, rushing toward him, arms wrapping tightly around themselves as if bracing against the wind. Lena. Ethan's grip tightened. She was running now, her silhouette growing closer, her breath visible in the cold night air. She reached the car just as he shifted into gear, slamming her hands against the window, her eyes wide and desperate. "Dame, please, don't go like this. Please." Her voice cracked, a plea wrapped in panic. But he didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Ethan, just let me explain," she begged, her palm pressing against the glass, fingers splayed. I didn't mean for this to happen." That was enough to snap something inside him. His head whipped toward her, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then tell me, Lena, what exactly did you mean?" She flinched, her breath hitching. For a moment she said nothing, her lips parted as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Forget it." He reached for the gear shift, but her voice stopped him again, raw and pleading. "I didn't want to hurt you." He laughed then, a hollow, bitter sound. "That's the thing, Lena. You didn't want to hurt me, but you did it anyway." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Lena took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold herself together with the sheer force of her own embrace. She wasn't crying, but her eyes shimmered under the glow of the headlights, her face pale and drawn. "I never stopped loving you, Ethan," she whispered. Something inside him twisted painfully at those words, at the way she said them, as if they were meant to fix what had already been shattered. He could have laughed again, could have asked her how she defined love if it meant sneaking away in the night to be with another man. Instead, he swallowed the anger burning at the back of his throat and stared at her, really stared at her, as if trying to understand the stranger standing before him. "Then why?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost tired. "Why do this?" Lena swallowed, shifting on her feet. She looked away toward the overlook where Noah still stood, watching from a distance, hesitant to intervene. "I don't know," she admitted, and it was the first honest thing she had said all night. I don't know how it got this far. Ethan's hands flexed against the steering wheel. That was the part he would never understand. It wasn't a single reckless mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment fueled by too much wine and a moment of weakness. This was a choice, a series of choices, made over and over again until it had become something real, something tangible. She hadn't tripped and fallen into Noah's arms. She had walked there, willingly, night after night, while Ethan had been at home, waiting for her, believing her. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. I get it now. Lena's breath caught, her fingers curling into fists. Ethan! But he was already shifting the car into drive. This time, when he pulled away, she didn't chase him. He drove without direction, his mind a tangled mess of memories and emotions, the weight of everything pressing against his chest. He could have gone home, but the thought of walking into their shared space, of seeing the remnants of their life together scattered across every room, made his stomach churn. He didn't want to sleep in the bed where she had laid beside him with her secrets. Didn't want to sit at the kitchen table where they had once laughed over morning coffee. Didn't want to exist in the same space that had become a lie. Instead, he drove until the city lights blurred, until the road stretched endlessly ahead, until the past felt just a little further behind. Eventually, he pulled into an empty parking lot overlooking the water, turning off the engine but making no move to step outside. He sat there in the darkness, his fingers tapping against the wheel, his mind still struggling to process everything. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He didn't need to look to know it was Lena. He let it ring. The betrayal had already been done. There was no unspooling it, no rewinding time, no rewriting the story into something softer, something that hurt less. The only thing left to do now was decide how it would end. Ethan exhaled, long and slow, watching the night sky through the windshield, the stars stretching infinitely above him, and for the first time in a long time he realized he didn't need to stay trapped beneath them. Not anymore. Ethan sat in his car for what felt like hours, parked in an empty lot that overlooked the still waters of the bay. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of passing cars on the highway, the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. He wasn't sure how long he had been there. Long enough for the initial surge of anger to fade into something heavier, something colder. The phone beside him had buzzed multiple times, Lena's name flashing across the screen again and again, but he hadn't touched it. There was nothing left to say. He leaned his head against the seat, exhaling through his nose, staring at the dark horizon ahead. His mind replayed everything from the past few weeks, twisting each moment through the lens of what he now knew. The nights she had come home late, the quiet conversations she had brushed off, the lingering scent of perfume that wasn't for him. It had all been there, hadn't it? The truth just beneath the surface, waiting for him to notice. Ethan ran a hand over his face, dragging his fingers down to his jaw. The exhaustion was creeping in now, deeper than just the lack of sleep. It was the weight of realization, the acceptance of something irreversible. This wasn't just an argument, something they could talk through, something that could be forgiven. Lena had chosen to betray him, had chosen to wrap her life around another man while still keeping Ethan in the dark. And now that she had been caught, she was suddenly desperate to explain. But explanations didn't change the past. Finally, Ethan reached for his phone. He stared at the missed calls, at the unread messages, each one a variation of the same thing. Ethan, please call me. I didn't want you to find out like this. I just need to talk to you. Can we please just meet somewhere? Just for a little while? He hovered his thumb over the screen, contemplating blocking her number entirely. The idea of severing that final thread between them was tempting, clean, absolute. But something inside him hesitated, some deep, bitter part of him that wanted to hear what she had to say, not because he believed it would change anything, but because he wanted to know how far she would go to justify what she had done. His thumb pressed against the call button. It barely rang once, before she picked up. Ethan. Her voice was breathless, as if she had been waiting, hoping, barely able to breathe until he called her back. Ethan, Save it, he cut in, his voice cold, steady. He didn't want apologies, he didn't want excuses. You said you wanted to talk, so talk. There was a silence on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, careful. I don't even know where to start. Ethan laughed, a short, humorless sound. Try the truth. For once, Lena swallowed audibly. It's not what you think, she said, but he could hear the lie in her voice already. Noah and you, Ethan repeated bitterly, shaking his head. Go on. I'm dying to hear how this ends, she faltered. I never wanted to hurt you. That's the second time you've said that tonight, Ethan said flatly. It's starting to sound rehearsed. More silence. Then, finally, it just happened, Lena whispered. The words set his teeth on edge. It just happened, he echoed, his grip tightening round the phone. So, what, you just tripped and landed in his arms? You accidentally found yourself sneaking out to meet him? You somehow ended up spending your nights lying to me because the universe willed it? I don't expect you to understand, she said, and for the first time there was something defensive in her tone, something that sounded more like frustration than remorse. I didn't plan for any of this. Ethan forced himself to breathe. That's the problem, Lena. You didn't plan for it, but you let it happen over and over again. She didn't answer. I bet it was exciting, he continued, his voice sharper now, each word like a blade. The secrecy, the thrill of sneaking around. Did it make you feel alive? Like you were part of some grand, tragic love story? Ethan, stop. He shot back. You didn't stop, did you, when you had the chance? She made a sound then, something close to a sob, but Ethan didn't feel sympathy. He had given her years of his life. He had given her trust, love, loyalty. And in return, she had given him lies. I don't love him, she whispered finally. Ethan shut his eyes. He wasn't sure why that made it worse. Then why? His voice was quieter now, not pleading, just tired. Why do this? A long pause. I don't know, she admitted. For a second, just a second, Ethan almost believed her. But it didn't matter anymore. All right, he said, nodding to himself, as if he had finally made a decision he wasn't aware he had been holding back. Then we're done here. No, Ethan, please. But he had already pulled the phone away from his ear. He let her voice fade into the static before hanging up. Then, without hesitation, he went to his settings, scrolled down to her name, and blocked the number. It was done. No more explanations, no more pleas, no more room for the words, I didn't mean for this to happen, or, I don't love him. Lena had already made her choice. And now, Ethan was making his. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel. The ache in his chest was still there, still raw, but for the first time, there was something else beneath it. Relief. Because now, there was nothing left holding him to her. The road stretched ahead, endless and open, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan realized he could go anywhere. Ethan didn't go home that night. The idea of stepping into the house he had shared with Lena, walking through the rooms still saturated with memories of her, was unbearable. Everything inside those walls, the books she left open on the coffee table, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the dent in the couch cushion where she always curled up with a blanket, would serve as a reminder of the life he had thought was real, the life she had been dismantling piece by piece behind his back. Instead, he drove. The city lights faded behind him as he followed the empty roads toward nowhere in particular, just a destination that wasn't familiar, wasn't filled with echoes of a past that now felt like a lie. The silence in the car was different now, not heavy with dread but something closer to clarity. The air smelled of asphalt and pine, the cold creeping through the cracked window, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't waiting for an answer. He wasn't analyzing Lena's words, searching for hidden meanings, trying to convince himself that things weren't what they seemed. No more second-guessing, no more questions. Lena had tried to call him again, using a different number. He had blocked that one too. Eventually, she gave up. Maybe she realized there was nothing she could say that would change things. Or maybe she was back with Noah now, falling into his arms, whispering about how complicated things had become. The thought didn't sting as much as it should have. It didn't matter anymore. After an hour of driving, Ethan pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner, a place he had passed a dozen times before but never thought to stop at. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, buzzing faintly in the night air. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as he crossed the threshold. The place smelled like coffee and grilled food, and the only other patrons were a trucker hunched over a plate of fries and an elderly couple sipping quietly from their mugs. He slid into a booth by the window and signaled for coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes but a kind smile, poured him a cup without a word. For a while he just sat there, his hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug, staring out at the empty parking lot beyond the glass. He let his mind drift, not toward Lena, not toward Noah, but toward himself. What now? For so long his world had revolved around his marriage, around the idea of building something together, sharing a future. He had envisioned anniversaries, vacations, maybe even a retirement where he and Lena sat on their back porch, watching the stars she had always claimed to love. But those were illusions, and now, standing at the edge of something new, he realized he had no plan for what came next. And maybe that wasn't a bad thing. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Across the room, the trucker let out a deep sigh, rubbing his face, before tossing a few bills on the table and heading for the door. The old couple spoke in hushed tones, their hands occasionally brushing across the table in quiet affection. Life was still moving. The realization hit him in a way that was almost startling. Lena's betrayal hadn't ended anything except the illusion of who he thought she was. The world hadn't collapsed. The sun would still rise tomorrow. He would wake up, make coffee, breathe, exist. And for the first time, he could do it without waiting for someone else's approval, without shaping his choices around another person's deception. He thought about calling someone, maybe an old friend he hadn't spoken to in too long, someone who had once been part of his life before everything had been consumed by work and marriage. But not tonight. Tonight was his. By the time he left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the first hints of dawn breaking against the horizon. He stood outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling the weight of the past few hours settle into something manageable. Then, with a slow exhale, he got back in his car and drove toward the unknown, toward a future that, for the first time in a long time, belonged only to him.